3. Welcome, everyone, to the Elusive I, the nature and function of the self. I'm joined, as always, with my partners on this wonderful journey, this amazing journey, Gregg Henriques and Christopher Mastropietro. I'll just let you guys say hi again.
Myself, happy to be here.
Likewise, very happy to be here. There we are, introduced.
Right.
And so what I'd like to do today with everyone is do a review of the argument, which is the crux argument in some ways from last time. The argument made by Letherby and Durans, or Garans, I don't know how it's pronounced, against the self being real, and review their argument and the counter argument that I proposed. And then they were also already in debate with a view put forward by Howie and Michael, also 2017, so they're contemporaneous. And I want to go through that argument and their account for why it's real and how that dovetails. I'll again remind you what both of them are presupposing is the case. They both admit to a lot of the machinery that we've already talked about here, and the difference is about whether or not the self model has the correct referent, and we talked about that last time. I'll review that in a second. Okay. Then what I want to do is I want to go into sort of a final substantial challenge. Again, not because it's exhaustive, but because it's exemplary. This is the work of the philosopher, cognitive science scientist Metzinger, and his argument for no self, which sounds like a Buddhist thing, and I guess he doesn't deny that possible association, but his arguments are totally derived from cognitive science. We'll get into some really interesting empirical work around the rubber arm illusion and out-of-body experiences and all that cool stuff. And then I want to look at a response made by a person named Ghin, Ghin, specifically to Metzinger, but independently and deeply convergent with the argument that I made last time. And that will sort of wrap up. Each one of these could be its own series. The whole no self debate could be a whole series. There's an excellent anthology on there. We could have a whole series on just, from primate to personhood, and Gregg has been doing ongoing work about that. But that's where we're going to bring what you might call the core cognitive science argument to a close. The series is not ending, because then we are going to move into more speculative, in the non-pejorative sense of that term, topics as we explore the existential and spiritual dimensions of the 3 S's, the self, spirit, and soul, which we've already alluded to. And when that happens, sort of the center stage will pass to Gregg and Chris, and there'll probably be 4 to 5 episodes around that. And then that will bring us to the end of the Elusive. And forever and for always, human beings will never have to worry about this topic ever again.
Structure and function of self will be resolved.
It'll all be resolved.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. You guys can just go get a beer. We'll have taken care of it.
So hubris that is going to bring the wrath of the gods aside, let me try and do the review. So we are talking about this debate between Letherby and Durans. And I just want to remind you what Letherby and Durans acknowledge. They acknowledge all of this machinery, the important functionality of relevance realization, salience, adaptivity. They acknowledge and support all of the work done on self-relevance and binding. They admit both sides, but Letherby and Durans specifically admit the existence of a functional self-model that basically binds higher order agency together and to the world. A lot of the machinery that we independently explored, yes, which is good convergence, I think. Now, what they do is they disagree with Howie and Michael, and ultimately with the argument I proposed and Gregg and Chris supported. They argue that all of this functionality and the real self model is insufficient for being a real self. Yep. And we took a look at this. What's the main core of their argument? The main core of the argument, the model is real. Okay, and all the functionality of the model is real. So the model really exists and it really functions to enhance agency. And let's note that, right? But what the model refers to, what is modeled by the model, doesn't exist. That's their main argument, that the content of the model is the Cartesian substantial self, although they play around with Aristotelian and Cartesian notions, but I won't go over that again, right? And they argue that the model, while functioning, represents itself in an illusory fashion. Okay, and that, you know, and that lines up with Hood, who said when we talk about the self not existing, we don't mean that there's nothing there at all. We talk about it not existing in the way that we thought it did, right?
Right.
Because when there's an illusion, you know, the stick in bent water, well, the stick looks bent, but that doesn't mean there was no stick at all. That's the kind of idea there, right? All right. So we moved into that and took a look at their proposal that the model of the self model is inherently of something like a Cartesian substance, a Cartesian soul. This is a stable object thing. And to be fair to them, this does line up with a lot of the features that we saw way back when we looked at the folk model. So to be fair to them, right? A stable object thing made out of immaterial homogeneous stuff. It's a soul thing, right? Right. And the key claim is that we not only experience the emergent, we not only experience sort of what they call emergent endogenous integrative patterns, right? We not only experience all this binding and relevance realization and fittedness, we also give this a locus. We say this all is located in, the model claims that all of this is located in a substantial soul thing. So all of these patterns are ultimately properties or predicates of the soul thing. And then they argue all of that is false. So I pointed out some issues that I think that are empirically backed, and then issues that are theoretically argued with this. So I'm not sure of their argument that this is the universal content of the self model. It might be ours, but they're making a scientific and not a historical claim. They're arguing that this is a nomological, a law-like feature, an essential property of the self model, that its content is always thus and this, right? And I think that that is undermined by a good historical review. We took a look at, even within the folk model, people do have this homogeneous thing, but they also talk of the self as a developmental system, something that has parts, something that develops, something that emerges, something that can fade away in Alzheimer's, et cetera, et cetera. I talked about the Egyptians, right, and right, and they even located it in their liver, right, and they had the ba and the ka and other thing, and the body. We talked about, I believe we talked about Stang, right, and the idea of the second and third century, that we weren't individuals, but the self is primarily a dividual between the spark and the divine double, and the self was fundamentally in the relation between those two poles, an aspirational relation, and that was widely prevalent and dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world. So I think the claim that this is a nomological necessity is undermined, and it gets reduced, therefore, to being a historical claim, that we in the culture, for historical reasons, might have internalized this particular model. But culturally internalizing this content is not the same thing as saying that the model inherently produces this content. Those are two fundamentally different claims, especially when we're trying to talk about the cognitive science of the self. Secondly, I pointed out that the normative criteria here, the criteria for realness, is kind of strange, and I thought there was a performative equivocation going on here. I noted that we have increasingly moved away from Aristotelian and Cartesian substance view of entities. We don't think of the table as a homogeneous extended stuff in space. We think of it as a dynamical systems of quarks and molecules, right? And we don't typically regard, I mean, there are moves where people try to say it's all an illusion. There are really no tables. The problem with that is the only thing that ends up being real is the very bottom of your ontology, and then explaining how we do science on these illusory levels about the bottom level becomes incredibly mysterious and inexplicable. So that kind of what I would call ham-fisted reductionism is, and it's not the prevalent position in cognitive science anyways. And that takes me to, we have long ago in psychology and cognitive science given up the idea of the mind as a homogeneous Cartesian substance. We think of the mind as a developmental, emergent, dynamical system, but we don't thereby conclude, you know what, the mind's an illusion. We haven't done that. We think, oh no, what we thought we were actually referring to this. We thought we were referring to that, but we were actually referring, and that's what we really meant all along. That's what we've done. And so there's no violation of semantic propriety or theoretical construction here to say, oh, what we were referring to, what we were pointing at, because that's how reference works with this notion of self. Turns out it wasn't a Cartesian soul. Turns out it was a developmental dynamical system that's working at multiple temporal scales, blah, 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 all the stuff we've already talked about. And as we're going to see, that's basically the argument that is being made. We'll see this is the argument being made implicitly by Howie and Michael and being made explicitly by Ginn.
I made a comment, I think, just at the time, just to reiterate, this is a very easy thing for people to get confused about, I think.
Yeah.
And I argue that basically Skinner does this with sleight of hand in mind, essentially.
Yeah.
He basically says, oh, because there's some not weird causal thing in mind, then it's behavior. And then actually in several quotes, he says, well, mind is behavior. That's what I've been saying all along. And it's like, well, is that what you've been saying?
Yeah.
Mind was behavior?
Yeah.
So anyway, I've actually seen, ever since we had this conversation, I've even seen a few other examples of where people are making the contrast and then the reference switches and then you get a lot of confusion in relationship to the argument.
Thank you, Greg. I think that's right. I think if you look around, I mean, I just gave a couple of examples, but I think if you look around, I think this kind of confusion does recur, is somewhat pervasive in the history of science in general, and also in within the history of psychology. It'd be interesting to see how that kind of performative equivocation is matching up with propositional equivocations around things like information, and epistemological stances. So there's a lot going on there. Well, you well know. I mean, the conceptual morass of the self is but a species of the conceptual morass of psychology, as you have made very, very clear. And and you've drawn out that those two morasses in our discussions, they influence each other in profound ways. So thank you for that. So then we took a look at the central move made by Letherby and Durance to try and really push for the illusion, is they say something that, again, stands on the horizon of equivocation. They say, but the self disappears in these experiences of self-transcendence. And they point to all kinds of work, to which I heartily agree, that, from insight through the flow state to full-blown mystical experiences, right? People report a loss of self, right? And so we took a look at that. So the sense of the narrative self disappears, and we keep returning back again and again to the topic of the connections between self, narrative, and the phenomenological experience of being a temporally extended, morally responsible agent, and how narrative may be indispensable for that, but that doesn't mean it's indispensable or necessary to selfhood. And we talked about animals, and then Gregg did his amazing thing where he said, look, you can get this far up without narrative, and then once you go into narrative, and then once you get narrative going and within a cultural context, justification problems open up, and then we have to move around to justification space, etc. And Gregg has already provided that in detail. I am requesting that well, I'm requesting that Gregg, because his diagrams are so bloody beautiful, he's going to do a schema of that I sort of think is the emerging gist of what I've argued for with their help, and then what he's argued for, and then put the two together, and we'll provide that for all of you as as summarizing schemata that we can consult as we go forward.
Perfect.
Okay, so I made the point that what might be happening, and this was speculative, although I think it's rational speculation, that in those experiences, right, because human beings are not just considering import tense, how things are relevant to them, but because they, for the reasons Gregg articulated, they are social, cultural, and how they matter to others beyond their egocentric concern is crucial to to cultural agency. And I think Gregg made that clear. There's the inversion in which the binding glue of self-relevance changes its orientation from this way, if you'll allow me metaphorical reference, to that way. And the gluing is the gluing of the world, the oneness of the world, and the sense of identity is found there. And so all of the machinery is going. The basic idea is that the hyper object that is the self is used to give us a participatory knowing of the hyper object that is reality. And whether or not that's ultimately a real self, I think is something that the previous argument says, it's not irrational to think it is. Okay, and then like I said, we did sort of some summary around that. And I just wanted to pause now if you guys wanted to interject about that summary before we move to the new material.
No, I think that's a good, rich summary. I mean, I think that we're building the stacking of the agent-arena relationship and the layering upon that in a particular kind of way that clarifies what the models are, clarifies what the structural functional properties are, and now we're getting ready to make the kind of final crescendo argument.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Well, about this part of it, I mean, we keep coming back to some central and important points that Chris made about that all of this is important, but I don't know quite how to refer to it, but the existential identification that's at the core of the self needs to be, and we've done things to try and situate that in, but we need to keep discussing it, which is why why we are going to discuss the three S's, self, soul, and spirit, as a way of trying to unpack that as much as possible. Well, let's finish as much as we can right now with self.
Right. One way of thinking about where we are, at least so you can, when we think about this issue, in personality theory, sometimes you approach it, I teach it, and I'll say, hey, personality theory is sort of like how we're like everyone else, how everyone's alike.
Yeah.
How we're like some other people, and then we have to hold how we're like nobody else, how we're completely unique. Okay. Yep. So we're creating, in my estimation, what we're doing here with the cognitive science, we're trying to create the fundamental architecture of the self. Yep. That would be for all typical individuals. This is the basic architectural structure. Then we can actually talk then about some individual different stuff, and then maybe get into some unique aspects down the road. But that would be one way of framing it.
And that ultimately dovetails with your work, Gregg, because, I mean, and this is a Kierkegaardian point, right? Because morality is ultimately, it's not exclusively, but it is often ultimately unique to me, right? I bear unique moral responsibility. And that's part of Kierkegaard's point about the existential. And we've always said from the beginning that one of the things the self has to do is explain both our shared personhood, our shared selfhood, but also our unique selfhood. And I should shut up because that's Chris's point. Did you want to say anything about that?
No, you said it well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But only that when we talk normatively or existentially about what it means to consolidate a relation with oneself, usually I think what is meant, certainly in in the Kierkegaardian sense, what is meant is that is an integration of what is transpersonal and what is personal.
Yeah. And I think what Chris said there is that's a really important point, that this relationship between the personal and the transpersonal, it's not identical to, but there are deep importance between the transpersonal and these more essential and universal aspects of the self that the cognitive science can disclose. And so there are important bridging points that can be made here. And we've already started exploring some of those. I think it was 2 sessions back. Okay, so I want to go properly now into the Howie and Michael's argument. And again, I've already laid out what they share with Letherby and Durans, and then why they come to the conclusion that the self is real and that everything in that model is sufficient for a self. And then, like I said, I want to give that one more challenge from a big voice on the no self side, Metzinger, and then a response to that. And again, we're not claiming this is any way exhaustive, but I think it's at least doing due deference and due diligence to exemplary positions in this all-encompassing debate that spans civilizations and cultures. So what's their model? Okay, so the core of their model is something that I've mentioned along the way and something that's becoming very prevalent. And it's something that both Gregg and I have advocated for, first independently and now convergently and cooperatively, which is an attempt to get an integrative big picture framework within which you do psychology or even broader cognitive science. And that's the work of Carl Friston, and then it's been developed by people like Andy Clark. It's been developed by a former student of mine and somebody I'm collaborating with right now on a paper, Mark Miller. The importance of Andy Clark's, and especially to Mark's work, is Mark moves it from sort of the original computational framework, and Friston has moved with this. He's not resisting this, he's agreeing with this, right? From a computational framework into an embodied, interactive framework like we have been arguing throughout. Most people now talk about embodied enactive, what's called predictive processing. So predictive processing is the model. And man, is it gaining traction. It's gaining theoretical plausibility through extensive argumentation and gaining empirical probability through extensive empirical confirmation. And so I think it is a very powerful and emerging framework.
Agreed.
Gregg, did you want to say anything there? Because your sense of the scope of psychology as a whole is better than mine.
Right. I want to put cognitive science under it, John. But anyway, we can certainly agree that predictive processing, right? And I would say with the twist of a recursive relevance realization formulation that embodies it in an agent arena environment has an enormous integrative possibility across many stacked levels of processing.
And that's the point I was going to make. So thank you for doing that. So I'm working with Mark Miller and Brett Anderson to actually integrate the predictive processing model with recursive relevance realization. That's explicit. And to try and use that to explain a broad framework for cognition that's already convergently being proposed by multiple people between sort of represented, and don't put too much on these, but between sort of, there's an autism schizotypic continuum that all individuals are found on. And this may help to integrate a lot of stuff together in a powerful way. So what's the core of the predicting processing model? There's the one idea goes back, way back, and you can see it in Pavlov, and then you can see it in Rescorla, especially in 1988. Pavlovian conditioning, it ain't what you think it is. I think he's tries to be really colloquial.
Like that, yeah.
And he basically criticizes the behaviorist model of understanding Pavlovian conditioning as what he calls willy-nilly associationism. And he argues that the empirical evidence actually undermines that. And what is more the emerging consensus, and then predictive processing plugs into this, is that even at the basic levels of conditioning, you're not seeing association. What you're seeing is anticipation. The organism is trying to predict the world and prepare for it and prepare for the world. So it's always an act of adaptive agency, of prediction and preparation. So when I say anticipation, I mean that bi-directional thing of predicting and preparing. And so the idea is the way organisms are adaptive, the way in which organisms we might properly want to call cognitive or adaptive is the way in which they can learn, right? And Gregg has pointed out that is a pivot point on your ontology, when organisms can learn and then they increase their adaptivity by being able to anticipate the world. Okay, so that sounds all wonderful, but for a long time there's been problems with that because you seem to get into these weird homuncular loops. And let me try quickly to explain what that might be. So when we moved from computational models, we moved to things called neural networks. And what you would do is you'd get the neural network to try and predict the world, and then to get neural networks to learn, we did what was called the back propagation of error. Well, what that meant is the network would produce some output, and then we would say what output it should have produced, what was called the target value. Let's say we're trying to get a network to distinguish between dogs and cats. Okay, so we show pictures of dogs and cats, and initially we hold up a picture and it goes clickety-whir and it says dog, and that's wrong. And we say, no, you should have said cats, right? And then what we do is we take the target value, and because you can turn this all into math, so that's not problematic. We take the target value and we subtract the performance value, and then we get how much of an error. And then what we do is we propagate back through the network and we adjust all the connections between the nodes, and we slightly adjust it. You don't want to do it rapidly because there's good reasons for that, and I won't go into that. And then you try it again and you try it again, and that's called the back propagation of error. And most neural networks in commercial functionality use backprop because it trains networks up really fast.
Yep.
And so it's a powerful technology, but it is shit science. Why? Because it depends on something independently having learned the target value. So it's homuncular because it says, you know how learning works? Something else has already learned and then gives me the correct value, and then I correct myself. So that cannot be an account of how we learn. And don't say, my parents teach you, because you have to be able to learn from your parents. Yes, some stuff might be innate, but you can't make enough stuff innate to account for all of human learning. And I've got extensive arguments about those points in detail, and I'm not going to go over them right now. Okay, so this has been a big problem, which is how do you get networks, right, to learn without making them homuncular, without giving them the target value? Now, what happened is both from work within machine learning from Hinton and then stuff that comes out of Friston, you have this really, really good idea. I want to sort of point out that in 2012, the work I did with Tim Lillicrap and Blake Richards, we sort of predicted this as a strategy. We called it internalization. And this has turned out to be convergent with what's coming, what's emerging in predictive processing. And here's the basic idea. And notice how this tracks with everything we've been talking about with the self. The basic idea is the brain doesn't try to predict the world. The brain tries to predict that part of the brain that is causally coupled to the world. The brain, and we talked about this, the brain is modeling itself in order to model the world. And as it's modeling the world, it is inherently modeling itself. This is the internalization strategy, and that's at the core of predictive processing. And the idea then is what you do is you have layers, right, of this. So let's say here's layer one. This is the part of the brain that's directly coupled to the world. And then layer two is trying to predict layer one. And in trying to predict layer one, what it does is it models, not in any pictorial or propositional sense, but it creates a model, an anticipatory modeling of the causes that are causing the patterns that are showing up in the sensory motor level of the brain. Right? And then you have a level 3 that's trying to anticipate level 1 and a level 4. And what you have is higher and higher orders of modeling, right? And notice these are more and more hierarchical modelings of the self, or at least of there's at least the recursive modeling of the modeling of the modeling and modeling itself in order to model the world. All of that's going on. And notice, and then the idea here is as I move higher up, or I'll use it this way, deeper, as I go into deeper levels of layers, I'm going into more and more abstract, more temporally extended models of the world. And so we've got what we've been talking about throughout. We have, right, different levels of relevance realization, adaptive anticipation. I'll get to that in a sec, right? At different temporal scales, you know, an immediate scale, more and more, and the self reaches within all of them by it's modeling itself in order to model the world, and in modeling the world is it inherently modeling itself. Notice how this lines up with everything we've been arguing for. And so you get this, right? And what's happening is it's also, it's as much procedural as it is modeling, right? Because what's happening is the brain is also practicing at getting better at modeling, because what you can do within the brain is you can give corrective feedback within the brain. That solves the back propagation. One can tell two, this is what you should have predicted, because one is there. It's in the brain. There's nothing homuncular there. One can feed, this is what you should have, right? I'm being anthropomorphic to speed up. And then two goes, oh, and then two gets better at modeling one. But in getting better at modeling one, it indirectly gets better at modeling the world. And so you get this ratcheting up that's very procedural in nature. Okay.
John, can I give you an example? Just to maybe
please.
Let me offer an example and see if this. And so all of a sudden, I want to have breakfast. Okay. So would it be fair to say then that there would be a hierarchical arrangement of goal states that I would then could break that structure into, and then be like, okay, I got to go over to the fridge. I have to get eggs. I have to get out the pan. I have to do all of that. There are certain levels in which that's going to be modeled at various levels of abstraction. Right.
And then at the very lowest level, you're getting things like the brain is trying to reduce the surprise that's going to happen. Right. That you can think of all of this as an attempt to reduce surprise. So it's predicting that there's going to be certain sensory motor patterns that indicate your arm is reaching that are going to correspond to the sensory motor patterns that correspond to you seeing the inside of your fridge. And if you open your fridge and there's no food in there, you're surprised, right? And you have to update your model.
Exactly.
And then there's two ways you can update your model. There's two ways in which you can deal with surprise. You can revise your model, and you think about how sort of science and engineering correspond to these. You can revise your model to better fit the world, and notice the language I'm using, or you can revise the world to better fit your model.
Yep.
And that's the sensory motor loop. The sensory, right, revising the model, the motor revising the world, and they are interpenetrating and bound together.
It's funny because that actually came to mind. I just say, because I was making eggs, over the weekend? And I knocked the thing and I was just doing it normally. And then I hit it and I dropped the damn egg, right? Yeah. So the surprise of hitting the egg and then the feedback and then draw my attention. And then I say, shit. And then I got to clean this up, interrupt that little behavioral mode. And all of a sudden I got my little self-modeling from our conversations going like, oh, I'm starting to jump around my little perspectives here. So anyway. So
that's sort of the gist of the model. And notice how it's, you've got this recursive self-organization and its self-relevance, and different temporal scales are being integrated and modeling itself in order to model the world, and modeling the world, it models itself, and it's practicing on itself in order to improve its ability to practice in the world. We've been talking about all of this, right? Now, a couple things that might come to mind is, well, sometimes I like to be surprised. And then that brings up some important questions within predictive processing. And then something else, which is, right, when you try and use sort of mathematical formalisms, things like Bayes' theorem, to try and mathematically formalize how you reduce the surprise, you get into computationally intractable. It becomes computationally explosive. You can't do it. So what we do is we typically, this brings up the question, the recursive RR question, but what do I model? And what aspects of I model? And how temporally deep do I model? And how much should I revise it? And where does insight and where do affect and caring fit into this? And so what's happening now in predictive processing is there's a place in which where you have sort of a higher order thing. It's called precision weighting, and it's coming to dominate more and more. The predictive processing account is, well, how do I weight certain kinds of models? How do I basically prioritize? And that immediately gives you, well, what's the main function of attention? Prioritization, right? And what does it do? It alters salience, and then salience binds, and you can see you need relevance realization. This is rich for relevance realization. They originally tried reliability as what's going on in precision weighting, but reliability is like a vacuous. Either you mean numerical reliability, and then I would be tracing all kinds of horribly reliable and endlessly irrelevant things, which I don't do, right? And then they tried, Clark said, well, it's task relevance, which is like, oh, right? And now they're moving much more into this affective, caring self-organ, which is just rich and dripping with the juices of recursive relevance realization. So all of that sits together very well, and so I think I'm getting growing confidence in sort of a PP, triple R integrated framework that with also really grounds this model of the self that we've been developing together. Okay. One of the things you can also see, right, in this hierarchical model is it's also implementing some of the machinery of relevance realization. Like we talked about, just for those of you who know, but you compress information as you go up the stack, you particularize as you go towards generalized other, the generalized me, you come down to the particular me's, all that sort of stuff, right? It's all there. And this is what Howie and Michaels make use of. Now, one annoying nuance is Howie he's kind of defends a purely propositional model theory of the modeling that's going on at work. I think that's becoming progressively just indefensible, and so I'm not gonna hang anything significant on that. I think there are, by Friston and Clark and Miller and others, the embodied inactive version of PP is going to dominate and is dominating the field. And this lines up with all the rest of embodied cognition. Michael Anderson has done work on this too, and we talked about him with XF. Just a lot of convergence on this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Okay, so what do we get out of this? There's 3 points I want to take. First, the system models itself in order to model the world, and as it models the world, in order to take care of itself, right? And it's fundamentally taking care of itself in anticipating itself, right? As the system is forming deeper, more hidden causal model of the world, it correspondingly needs to form deeper models of itself. So because it's prediction and preparation, right? And those are always bound together, right? As it makes more causally deep predictive models of the world, it has to get deeper and deeper models of its own causal potential in order to have better and better preparation for the world. And those two are bound together. So as the self becomes temporally extended in prediction, it becomes temporally extended in preparation. Is that okay?
Yeah, not only that, I want to just interject and maybe say, to conceptualize this a little bit more easily, to me, the functionality is not unlike that of a large institution, both in the sense of generalization and compression as you get further up the hierarchy, but also in the sense that more and more and more of its own resources need to be dedicated to its own self-modeling in order to sustain itself across time. And large institutions, whether they be, large bureaucracies, for instance, tend to function very much in that way, right? Or even entire cities, if we go back to the Republic. So hearkening back to some of those representational models of selfhood and the machinery of selfhood as analogous to large organizations, I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it.
That's very good. The multiplicity of the self as society, as Minsky once wrote. Yep. But you're right, Chris. it goes back to Plato.
It goes back to Plato, as everything does.
Everything does. Right.
And we can take that analogy to all kinds of different places, but at least for this moment, even just the functionality you've just described seems appropriately mapped.
No, I think that's good. And let's remember that when we talk about, because I want to get into, the multiplicity of the self, in basically what I would argue are ultimately Platonic practices like IFS and things like that, especially the imaginal versions of IFS. So that's more for soul and spirit. Okay, so I think that's a good point. I want to point out that there, and this is just a quick sideline, that means there is a finite limit on intelligence. So you have what's called complex system theory, which is, and you study this in societies. So you can, like in the Roman Empire, and some people propose this also for the Bronze Age world. But the idea is the system complexifies in order to deal with the complexity of the world, but it has to be modeling itself more and more and more. And what happens is it has fewer and fewer resources that it can devote to the world because it becomes itself a complex environment. And then eventually it collapses. So there's actually a finite limit on intelligence. And then some people, argue that...
Chris, your point about bureaucracy makes all that much more sense, doesn't it, though?
There's definitely diminishing returns. And then there's an open question about whether or not we are near that point. Ted Chiang, the amazing science fiction writer, actually wrote a really penetrating essay arguing that, the predicted explosion in artificial intelligence is likely not going to happen precisely because of these kinds of inherent limitations. And that we might be close to as smart can be. Now that sounds terrifically arrogant and anthropomorphic and anthropocentric, but it's a viable question that we might be near there are really good arguments that we're biologically near the limit, that you can't get something biological made out of, carbon-based single cells to be much more intelligent than us. There's good arguments about that. So we're at the biological threshold. And then the question is, how much similarity is there between the biological threshold and the sort of a priori threshold that comes out of complex systems theory? And that's a reasonable open debate. That I think people should take a look at. Okay, that aside, because maybe there can't be angels, I don't know. But anyways, the third point. So that model of itself, of its deep causes, need to include its modeling behavior. So because the self is primarily modeling, when it's modeling itself, it's primarily modeling its modeling behavior, right? And so the 3 points again, it models itself in modeling the world, right? And this is the way it takes care of itself. As it forms deeper models of the world, it forms deeper models of itself. And in modeling itself, it has to be modeling its modeling function because that's what it primarily is, okay? And so that means that in a very real sense, right, it faces this problem we've just talked about, which it needs to be able to modify how transparent it is to itself. Now, let me try and explain what I mean by that. And we've talked about transparency, opacity already along the way. So remember, right now my glasses are transparent to me because I'm looking through them, but I'm also looking by means of them. They are a lens that focuses what is, available to me as an analogy to what's salient and relevant to me. In the same, the self model in modeling itself has to be able to model through itself onto the world. Right. And if it gets too focused on itself and modeling itself, if it becomes completely opaque to itself, it hits the collapse I just mentioned, right? The collapse of the Roman Empire, because it gets enamored into itself, kind of a horrific epistemic narcissism or something, that so much so that it becomes blinded to the world. And so there has to be a transparency or at least a translucency. It has to be capable of transparency, opacity shifting. Again, that now makes sense with the phenomenology that we've talked about and how that has an impact on our phenomenological sense of self, that transparency, opacity shifting. I'm trying to show you how we can fit a lot in that's consonant, and we're getting some of these major conclusions coming out. Okay, now that leads me to a point I want to make.
Let me just make a quick side note, just a very quickly.
Please.
So if we think about this in terms of flow versus neurotic self-consciousness. And just
exactly. Yes.
Sort of like the grip of the self-other world and the ease and efficiency with which that modeling of the self, modeling of the world, and the feedback loop, and then the lack of like self-conscious awareness, at least in relationship to that flow, versus the errors, the awkwardness, the failure of participatory knowledge, and then the constant self-conscious, what the hell's going on with me and the world. And as a clinician, I could say then people start developing very narrowly reciprocal modeling and then actually get into maladaptive feedback loops that create mismatches between self and world. So that's just throw that out.
No, that wasn't a throw. That was a good point, Greg. That's a very good point.
Yeah, I think that's why the concept of the concept of translucency between transparency and opacity is so important.
Yeah,
precisely because you can't lose consciousness of the self model altogether, but it has to be sufficiently diminished as to allow for genuine participation in the arena. And I think that equilibration seems to be the dilemma oftentimes.
Well, and the point I want to make there, which is not going to surprise either one of you, is there isn't sort of a median mean in which we stabilize the transparency, in which we stabilize the translucency. That is constantly moving around relative to relevance realization all the time.
Okay.
And of course, that then maps on to a particular way in which, because we've already talked about, when we're talking about brain, we're really talking about brain-body, right? The embodiment. And again, autopoiesis, all of that. So again, I'm not bringing in something that we haven't discussed. And so I'm going to make a sort of a claim here that what we can see is the self model is identified with the body, but it's not identical to the body. Right? So this identification process is that translucency relationship. It's identified with the body, but it is not a model of the body. It's not identical to the body because it precisely has to afford seeing through the body to predict the world and seeing into the body in order to prepare it. So identified with the body, but not identical to the body.
Okay.
And I think, John, if I may, that identification with that coextension that you're talking about is then conferred onto the world when you talk about the transition from egocentrism to ontocentrism.
Very much.
Then the world becomes, if I can put it this way, the world becomes the body of the self.
Right.
In that shift.
Yeah, in that sense,
we'll get back to that, but you already mentioned that, so I wanted to map that over again.
No, I think that's good.
Tapping at the same
very good, and that shows up mythologically, even in things like the body of Christ and things like that. So I think that this gives something that isn't explicitly talked about by Hoey and Michaels, but so I'm doing it to sort of strengthen their case. This gives us the sense of ownership, but it's not the way we own an object like my jackknife. Our ownership of our bodies is this: we identify with it, but we're not identical to it. We identify with it and through it, but we are not identical to it. And that sense of ownership of a body, right, but not in the sense of ownership of an object, Merleau-Ponty made this really clear to us, right, is central, again, to the way in which we are a self. And I notice I said are a self rather than have a self, because I don't know what entity would be having this self. That doesn't make any sense to me. So that's the Hoey and Michael model. I hope I've strengthened it by showing how it just is convergent with everything we've been talking about. And you guys have been adding points. And also this additional point that I think follows from their model. It's implied, although they didn't explicate it. It gives us an account of ownership of the body as this identification with and through, but not identical to. All of this fits really, really well. So this is what they then claim. They argue that all of that is sufficient for being a self. That's the main claim. That's the main difference. And the point and Letherby and Garens really don't have anywhere along that way where they jump off and say, no, because they agree to all of this machinery and all of this argument in a fundamental way, as we've already seen. So how do they argue that it's sufficient? They argue, now, they don't quite use these terms. They don't use these terms, but they describe things that map onto this quite well, I would argue, interpretively, exegetically. This gives them an account of perspectival and participatory knowing and the relations between them that I think is very convergent with what we were talking about. It gives them a way of talking about an I-me relationship. As I've argued on their behalf, they point to it, but they don't really develop it. Ownership of a body in this weird sense of ownership that we've talked about. It's autopoetic. It does recursive, obviously recursive relevance realization, all those levels. It does self-relevance because it's predicting for preparation, right? It has non-logical identity through time. It's inherently self-organizing and self-defining and self-evolving. And so they then say, of course, this is not a Cartesian soul thing, but they think that it is nevertheless sufficient for selfhood. They sort of say, well, why isn't that enough for a self? And that's where their argument basically stops. And then the Letherby and Durans came in and made their argument. We agree with all of that, but what it models is the Cartesian soul. And we've already responded to that, which means we get to this position where, like, why isn't that enough? Unless you have some independent argument for privileging the exclusive identification of the Cartesian soul thing with the self, and I think that's going to be hard pressed to come up with that. It's not clear to me why that isn't sufficient for a self. So I'll pause here because that's sort of where we've. I wanted to show how, like, where we've gotten to. They have on the translucency issue. One thing they talk about the fact that part of what the self model has to do is render parts of the model transparent. Let me give you a non-controversial example. So I'm constantly blinking and saccading, which are actually creating moments of blindness, but my brain has learned to edit those out, right? And when I'm touching things, my brain has learned to edit out to some degree my self-touch, right? That's why you can't tickle yourself, right? Because your brain predicts what's going to happen and it prepares so that you can't, right? And so, again, there is an inherent degree, and this is just a specific version of what we're talking about. This model, in order to function, has to have a significant capacity for transparency, or it can't function. But that is part of its functionality, and maybe that should not, what I'm arguing, is that should not be used as a basis for claiming it doesn't really exist. So although it's phenomenologically has to be transparent, that doesn't mean that it's theoretically transparent, and that doesn't mean we should conclude that it doesn't exist. And then we've already looked at the Letherby and Durans argument, but I want to go in now to an argument that really focuses on this transparency issue and tries to argue for there not being a self on the basis of transparency, and that's the work of Metzinger in Being No One, and the more popular and therefore accessible book, The Ego Tunnel. And of course, a host of papers. Okay, so Metzinger has done some really, really powerful stuff. And so let's talk a little bit about transparency and illusion and some of the empirical work that he's done and why it's creepy and fascinating and interesting, and has to do with this aspect of ownership that I explicated it not only to help Howie and Michael, or I think it's Michael, but also to prepare us for Metzinger's argument. So he argues that we have what he calls a phenomenological self-model that's also almost completely transparent to us. And because it's almost completely transparent to us, that means we come up with fictional accounts of what it is. So it's basically, because it's phenomenologically transparent, it is empiric. We get no empirical, basically, evidence about it. And so we generate basically illusory and fictitious accounts of what it is, right? So he thinks to use some of our language, he thinks we ultimately have a final ultimate layer of framing that is completely transparent, And there's nothing beyond that. There's no self beyond the self-organization of that fundamental framing, but we posit something behind it in a homuncular and illusory fashion, because that layer, and I agree with him, has to ultimately be transparent to us phenomenologically. Did that make sense as an argument for you guys?
I'm following that.
I mean, we prepared everybody for that. We talked about this. We talked about framing. We've talked about transparency. We talked about the eye, that you can never see the eye. You can only see through the eye, right? And we've carefully distinguished, but tried to relate self-organization from organization into a self. And we tried to, so none of this should be novel to anybody. So,
John, you want to say, like, to me, certainly when I hear that, I hear adverbial. I mean, if we shift into some consciousness language, there's an adverbial framing that has analogous parallels to this.
Yeah, and I think that's what he talks about the ego tunnel. He talks about, and I think what he means by the tunneling is, salience landscaping, ultimately in relevance realization, and and this is a subtle point, Greg, and I'm hesitant to be definitive in my exegesis. I'm not definitive on my argument, but because I think we've pointed out, no, there is content, but it's adverbial rather than adjectival. And we've talked about that here, in the demonstrative indexicality, and that there is phenomenological access, but it's not adjectival or conceptual access. But that doesn't mean that there isn't access to the adverbial. Are you pointing to something like that, Greg?
Something like that. I guess what I'm saying is the framing of the self to look through as certainly analogous to when we're talking about consciousness, the adverbial framing of the adjectival qualia, right?
Right.
So, but they're not necessarily the same, but I'm just actually, they both feel like, there's a self-modeling, top-down, organized model self in relationship to the world, right? And then there's the attentional consciousness screen frame that affords adjectival qualia. Yeah. They're not exactly the same because one's more, attentionally grounded in sensory motor and one's more self-modeling. But when I am seen through my epistemological portal, you could see that actually adverbial and self-framing would at least, that would be an interesting thing to parse, perhaps.
Right. And so the analogy also, I think, is helpful because we argued that you get to states like the pure consciousness event, which go back to the kind of states that Letheby and Durand are making use of, in which all that are left are basically the adverbial qualia and the valence qualia. The adjectival stuff is completely gone. Yep. But nevertheless, right, we still have phenomenological access to consciousness, and we don't conclude that consciousness doesn't exist because there's this layer of ultimate transparency to it. So that's good. I hadn't thought about that. Putting those all together. I'm hesitating here because I think what you said was pregnantly insightful. That was an awkward phrase. But what I mean by that is, well, is he right? The fact that it's transparent might mean that we don't have adverbial and valence access, and that's a phenomenological content. It's not conceptual, it's not propositional, it's not adjectival, but it's still, right? So there might be, some degree of translucency at the adverbial and valence level. And secondly, when we have an analogous situation in consciousness, we don't conclude that consciousness isn't real. We just say, oh, isn't that interesting? It ultimately exists in this, right, sort of, more purely perspectival and procedural manner. Yeah. I just thought that was good, Greg. I just thought that was good. I just wanted to bring that out.
I think when we come back, why don't we go through his argument and then maybe we'll come back and see. But I just wanted to draw that parallel for some reflection.
Okay, so he argues that we fall prey to naive realism. Naive realism is the boogeyman of all philosophers. This is the basically the folk model of reality that we all have. Naive realism is that's just the way things are. Like the way I see things is the way they are. There really are X's, there really are Y. Naive realism isn't quite as clearly the boogeyman as we thought it used to be, because we used to use it to say, well, we think there are tables and chairs, but there really aren't tables and chairs. And in terms of social objects, maybe they're not, maybe they're only attributed, but that level of existence, as I've already argued, has to have a reality to it, or we get into all kinds of epistemological and metaphysical difficulties. So he argues, and I agree with him, that if we agree that naive realism is the model of the world that comes out of the folk model, and that science challenges those, I agree with him. Science in that sense challenges naive realism, but I've tried to point out that doesn't leave us with illusion. It just gives us sophisticated realism rather than naive realism. But what's the naive realism? He says, well, the naive realism posits a Cartesian soul thing as the homunculus behind the ultimately transparent framing. And we've seen this move already made by Letherby and Durans. Now, why does he do that? Well, unlike Letherby and Durans, who make use of psychedelic experience, he has his own experimental work that he's doing with other people. And it's really cool. And there's a whole bunch of research on this. And my colleague and RA and TA, Judson Kim, has done some work on this. So this is the rubber arm illusion. And this has to do with the self identifies with and through, but is not identical to its body. So what's the rubber arm illusion? So the rubber arm illusion is, so you have a table like this laid out, and you have sort of people can look at it in sort of a controlled fashion, because you don't want to allow people to sort of explore. We'll get right. I can't get into the details of why that's the case. Then what you have is you basically have people slide their arm right underneath the table. They don't realize that that's what they're doing. And as they do that, you basically have a rubber arm come out superimposed. So here's my arm under the table. Here's the rubber arm exactly on top, superimposed. And then what I do is I strike the rubber, I stroke the rubber arm with a feather. And at the same time, in synchrony, I stroke your real arm with a feather. And what people will report, and not only report, they behave, they feel that this is their arm. So like if you bend the rubber arm finger, they will flinch, and they'll experience a bit of phantom pain, which is really kind of creepy. So it's an illusion because, of course, the rubber arm is not their arm, but their sense of self, and what I just said, they identify with and to some degree through the rubber arm, although they're not identical to it. And here, the fact that they're not identical to it comes to the fore because of that. Now, because of the way the experiment is designed. Now, what they've been able to do is you can get this with empty space. We ask people to imagine an arm and think about what this means for the imaginal world. You can get them to imagine an arm, and you can create the rubber arm illusion with an imaginal arm, right? Which is like, holy crap. Right? So you can do this imaginally. Remember what I mean by imaginal. I don't mean an image in your head. I mean a pretended image projected onto the world, right? And then what you can do is you can get more sort of imaginal full body illusions. And then what you can do is you can use virtual reality to augment that. And you can get something that is getting closer and closer to a full-blown out-of-body experience. So what the classic out-of-body experience, and the fact that people have this is no longer contested. In fact, Metzinger has, gathered work and other people. So this is the experience people have reported of, and it's often associated, but it doesn't have to be with near-death experiences. People report floating above their body and the center, the locus of their perspectival and participatory knowing is not in their body anymore, and they can witness and look at their body. And this is not just like imagination in the view from above. This is the phenomenological field, and they have an out-of-body experience. And what seems to be progressing is that we are getting closer and closer to the point where we can induce that experimentally in people. And so Metzinger then makes a historical claim, and then he makes a really he makes his basic no self argument. The historical claim is he argues that these out of body experiences are the sort of cross cultural, cross historical source of the idea of something like a soul, a soul that is capable of moving independently from the body. And we might think of Pythagoras and soul flight and shamanic soul flight and things like this. And you know, this becomes a plausible proposal. Whether or not those things map onto the Cartesian soul, I think, is a much more contentious issue. The people in the Mediterranean in the 2nd and 3rd century that experienced the self as individually, they seem to have had out of body type experiences, and so I'm a little bit hesitant of that. But the idea that this has been a contributor, at least potentially, to the integrated thing-like nature of the soul, that's, at least, if we modify it the way I suggest, I think that becomes a plausible hypothesis. But if you give him that, I don't give him his stronger version, and maybe his argument needs a stronger version, but let's just give him this. Then he says, and look, that's an illusion, because you're not above your body. There's nothing there above your body. That's his point. And he says, if there's nothing there above your body, then there's nothing there inside your body. What's the difference? What's the ontological difference? That's his argument. And it's a good argument. It's a good argument. It deserves to be taken seriously, right? Well, first of all, I should stop. What do you guys think about that? What do you think about the proposal? I mean, I think it's very interesting because there's an independent debate, about how NDEs are evidence for immortality, and the fact that we can't get any confirming evidence, and the fact that we're starting to be able to generate out-of-body experiences experimentally, that really undermines that sort of move. So I think independently his research has significant scientific merit to it. But what I'm interested in now is the sort of core move he's making in this argument, right? The naive realism is apparently, I think, non-controversially illusory in the out-of-body experience. And so why is it also not equally illusory in the in-body experience? That's basically, he shifts the burden of proof, and he says the burden of proof is on you to show what the significant, when the model's in here, why is it real? And when it's out there, it's an illusion. That's the basic sort of move that's being made.
Right.
Both are naive realisms in which the brain is just, generating a model to deal with its experience that ultimately is illusory. So where do you sit on that?
The naive realism that it's trying to disabuse still seems to be of a very Cartesian variety.
Yes, and that's going to be the core of Gin's response, and it's convergent with the argument we've already made about Letherby and Durant. And Gin is not. I can't tell if Gin is aware of Letherby and Durant. I don't think he is, because he can't be, because he publishes before, right at the beginning of Metzinger's work, 2005. But it's convergent. I know that Letherby and Durant, I don't think. Do they cite Gin? I don't think so. Anyways, it's a very convergent argument. That's basically the argument I want to make too, but he made it better.
One argument that's related. So I'm not. It's kind of I think we've covered it. So I don't have, but it did jump me into dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah.
I don't know if does he making any comments about that in relationship to what it says about the.
I mean, he does when he points to depersonalization, derealization, and when he talks about the various syndromes like Cotard and Capgras, where people think other people are robots and they don't, right? Which is interesting, because that's regarded as an illusion because we are failing to attribute a self, which I think is actually problematic to his work. But we'll come back to that. And I can't remember if I'm mapping this right. And then there's one where people are convinced that their arm That's not my arm. It looks exactly like my arm, but it's not my arm. They lose ownership and they insist on having that arm surgically, like they want that arm surgically removed. So he does point to at least things that overlap with dissociative disorders, Greg.
Okay.
So, this body image self locus is malleable and it is subject to error. And that means, I think he's right. I mean, the way you show that a naive realism is false is by showing that your perceptual and conceptual systems are prone to error. But we don't go typically into complete skepticism and say, well, there isn't a world. There isn't a world. We say, no, we have to come up with an account of the world that preserves the reality of the world while taking into account the fact that our perceptual and conceptual systems are prone to error.
And it may also be worthwhile to preserve some sense of, or at least preserve the question as to whether those representational models, illusory though they might be, however unequal they are to the realism of their referent, doesn't necessarily mean they don't have efficacy,
yes,
or that they don't have some kind of developmental potency or existential import, right? I think the question, like saying that they're illusory isn't the same argument as saying that they're completely epiphenomenal, right? To me, I would want to infiltrate the gap between those two arguments.
Well, let me help your infiltration, because it's something I wanted to bring in before we turn to Gien. And this is Geiger's work on the third man factor. And so this is reliably reported. And again, and I've experienced this. And Julian Jaynes actually talked about this a long time ago, and he did that when he did that really annoyingly provocative book called The Origin of Consciousness. He means self-consciousness, by the way.
Right.
And it breaks down mind. Yep. And I remember one anthropologist saying to me, that's a book that contains 100 beautiful insights and 1,000 powerful errors. And so, yeah. But anyways, so the Geiger book, the third man factor is that people will often experience a sensed presence. And this can be shared. Shackleton had one, although it's actually the fourth person. I don't know why it became called the third man factor. There are people, and they were Shackleton's expedition, and they all had this shared presence of another person going with them. And sometimes it's just accompanying, but sometimes, as Chris says, it's deeply functional. I want to give two accounts of this. And how they're on the continuum with the out-of-body experience kind of thing. So there was an individual who was ice climbing. I don't know why people do this. I guess it's even more powerfully inducing it to the flow state. And as I would have predicted, they fell off. I don't mean to be crude. And they seriously hurt themselves. And they were with somebody else, and that person died. So they were suddenly alone and injured in a snow wilderness, right? And the person relates he was laying there, seriously considering, I guess I'm just going to die. And then he had a sensed presence coming up to him, and the sensed presence said to him, "Stand up, your nose is bleeding." And he was like, "What? Who cares?" He said, "Your nose is bleeding and it's not that bad. Use the blood in the snow so you don't walk in circles, and that will help you get out." And he went, "Oh, that's brilliant." And that's how he got out. Another instance. And notice how these are creepy. They feel like ghosts, right?
Sure.
So there was this husband and wife team, and they did, again, I don't know how you get this job. These are just two examples, by the way. They do underwater cave mapping.
Right.
I guess this is needed, and I guess somebody has to do it. And they used to work as a team. And what used to happen is they would have a rope, and she would hold onto the rope, and he would take the flashlight and explore, and then he would come back, and she would shine her flashlight, and they would orient. And she dies, and he's in grief, and he foolishly goes back to work, as people often do when they're in grief. The fact that he's in grief is probably also relevant, by the way. And he goes under, and without thinking, he lets go of the rope and swims away. And then he goes, "Oh, crap, there's nobody here holding the rope. And I'm in a big cave in the dark. Where's the rope?" Because he's been swimming around, and he's like, and he gets a sense presence of her saying, I'm over here. And he turns and shines the flashlight, and there's the rope. And that's how he gets out. Now, you can either go all supernatural and spooky, or you can talk about implicit learning and intuition and the insight machinery, the kind of stuff we've been talking about all along here, which I think explains this quite well. And the fact that we always are doing this kind of sense presence when we do it in figures in literature, we do it with our avatars in video games, and we even talked about sensed presence and sense of presence in video games. So we're really good at this. And what that points to is the out-of-body experience is on a continuum with this kind of bifurcation of the self and consciousness that is terrifically powerful for generating intuitive insight that can often be deeply adaptive. And of course, this fits into all kinds of ways in which imaginal entities might be efficacious for us. And we can talk about that perhaps later when we do IFS, or if we talk about IFS more. And so I think you're right, Chris. I think that they're not epiphenomenal. The fact that his experiments end up that way I don't think points to a correct mapping between the phenomenology and the functionality. There's something going on there that I think is on a continuum with the Solomon effect. You know, where if you get people to talk about their problems from third-person perspective rather than first-person, they get insight into their problems. Mm-hmm. So Igor Grossman has good experimental evidence for that. Other people have replicated it. And we all know that. You're really good at giving advice to your friends about their romantic foul-ups, but you're crap when you're being aware of your own, kind of thing. So all of that, I think, I want to put that in, right? That, again, it's not as cut and dry as Metzinger makes it seem, because his particular version of this is very epiphenomenal. But as Chris said, it's on a continuum with stuff that it seems to be actually highly functional and doing something important. Okay, if that's all right, just because I think that's an important point, I want to now turn to Ginn. And he gets... He says that Metzinger is basically making this equation: the soul is an illusion, and that's equal to the self as an illusion, because the soul models itself as a soul thing, and that's what the OBE, out-of-body experience, shows, right? Right. And Ginn argues, he argues that the self is a process, not an object. I would say, something like a hyperobject that's a temporally extended process, but we can get into that later. And he argues, and I came across this after I come up with this argument, so people have to trust me on that. I'm giving him full credit, by the way, and he has precedence. I'm acknowledging that right now. But he argues, science has shown that most objects are actually processes, but we do not conclude that they are not real. And we actually conclude that they might disclose a functionality that we didn't realize with the idea that they were sort of homogeneous lumps of stuff, right? And we still think these things as existing, and we still take that to be legitimate, right? And then he says, what kind of process? He basically says it's an autopoetic, self-sustaining system. It's convergent with this whole argument. The self model, in order to gain access to itself, coordinate and correct itself so as to, basically enable the system to sustain itself. The ultimate reason for all of this is a process of self-access, self-coordination, self-correction that is part of the autopoetic nature of agency. And that enhancement of agency, which we see even in the third man effect, is the reality that we're ultimately pointing to when we're pointing to the self. Because try to say that your agency is an illusion, I think, is deeply performatively contradictory. Like, who's making that statement and what's going on?
They have to do it very effectively and with a lot of agency to make the argument.
So, he talks about, it grounds, content and valence. It ultimately, it is ultimately convergent with the whole, recursive relevance realization, self-relevance model that we've built. And so we basically get an independent argument against Metzinger that repeats the argument made against Letherby and Jorenz. Yes, insofar as that experience is of a homogeneous soul thing, it is an illusion. But that doesn't mean that the self in body is that, right? It doesn't mean that. It could mean, right, a bunch of other things, and what it could mean is what people often also talk about the self as, a developmental process, right, that basically enhances agency. So I think we've come full circle. We've circled back to the folk model, and I think we've done good science, because I think the science really undermines that, and it undermines a particular folk model of the soul, if I'll put it that way, a naive, common sense, realistic model of the soul. But I don't think it ultimately undermines the self. It changes what we are talking about when we're talking about the self, just like science always does. And I'm happy to make that change. And I don't see what is threatening about that change to things we're going to talk about, like meaning and moral responsibility, et cetera. None of those seem to be lost. Agency and ownership are certainly not lost. And so I think we have done good science, good cognitive science, in that we have undermined common sense and explained the familiar with something that's unfamiliar, but is both theoretically well argued for and is experimentally well evidenced. And so that's where I'm going to close the cognitive science argument.
All right. Beautiful. All right. No, it's a great summary, John. I mean, I think that I really look forward to then picking up the cognitive science baton and sort of adding in a clinical theoretical baton, and to show, bridge both, I'll be bringing some clinical stuff, to bear. So what happens when people come into the clinic room in relation, and what do we see in like true self and defended self and these kinds of issues, and then the cognitive dynamic ground and the development of a relevance realization, and then into a self model, and then that offers agency. That's the kind of cognitive ground that I would be looking for to help guide me if I were doing clinician work. So I think it's a beautiful setup, and I think that there's lots of then elements that may actually jump back over into the folk psychological experience of being that we can sort of flesh out. And then I can hand it over to Chris some and talk some about sort of the existential implications of all of that.
I think you're muted, Chris. Chris, I think you're muted. Chris, can't hear you.
Sorry. Yep. I said, that sounds great, Greg. And what I'll do is simply bring all of my existential problems to bear, and hopefully all of this rigorous theoretical work can solve them.
Right. That's what it says outside my door. We solve all existential crises, right? As if.
No, that sounds good. I think we're really well positioned now. And that was excellent, John. Really,
thank you.
Really tight, really rigorous.
And I'm hoping along the way, when I've in unrecorded conversations with Gregg and Chris, I'd like to at least make some connections to the work Gregg and I did on Untangling the World Not on Consciousness, with this, especially because of this weird central phenomena for the self, which is self-consciousness. Yes. And try and put those two together, because both are built out of recursive relevance realization machinery and perspectival and participatory and procedural knowing. I think there is good grounds for such an integration, and that might help also to bridge between this more, I don't know what to call it, mechanical. That's not quite the word. More dynamical account of the self, and the developmental dynamical account, and the existential and clinical aspects of the self that are so central to its existence.
Absolutely. So like when we did the consciousness, we talked a lot about sort of, subconsciousness from a cognitive science view, or non-consciousness into what would then afford the stack layer from valence into adjectival and all of that. And when we actually get into the self, certainly for me, especially the self-conscious person justifier self, then we'll pull in, and I know you're amenable to this, but pull in some more psychodynamic thinking,
Totally.
In relationship to what that self and maybe the self-consciousness system really wants to see relative to what its felt modeling is. And then the dynamic tensions between that, and then now it starts casting shadows in relationship to aspects of the self.
Yeah, I've been reading some work inspired by sort of, the IFS edge of the psychodynamic, this sort of post-Jungian. And I'm reading Multiple Minds, Single Self, and then trying to argue against the mono mind, and that the self isn't really typically actually the integrated, homogenized mono thing. That's a particular, and they even argue that even within the West, even within psychology, the unified and the multiple view keep swinging around each other. And so again, that undermines the claim of Metzinger and Letheby and Durans that we always inevitably, model the self as a Cartesian, homogeneous, unified substance, and that's simply not true. And I think things like IFS, internal family systems therapy, are bringing in the tremendous functionality of not thinking of it that way. But what's interesting is that there's nevertheless, there's something they call the self, but it's not what we typically mean by the self. So we've got all that, and that might be more towards soul and spirit. And so it's just rich and juicy with potential to talk about. And so I'm really looking forward to that.
Beautiful.
So I've talked more than enough, and I thank you guys for your patience and your support along the way, and your reflections and refractions. Those were very helpful. But I now want to turn it over to you too, if there's any sort of final things you want to say at this point before we wrap things up for today.
No, I think you allude, certainly for me, I think we're now ready to make a bridge. I think we can talk some about the schematic that you have laid, then the jump over to some of the schematics that I have in relationship to that, put my particular spin on that, and then we'll see how that dance comes together and then sets the stage then for the next phase.
And I mean, there was already a good integration in episode 5. And so I'm expecting you're going to build on that and explicate and elucidate it more.
That's the trunk. I think we've got a structured trunk, and then we can fill in some tree leaves on it. I like those metaphors. So.
Yep. Good. Thank you, Greg. And Chris, is there anything you'd like to say at this point?
I'm just going to try and throw wind through the leaves, see how they rustle.
Well, that's good. I mean, you made some very, you both did. You both made some very excellent points. And we got, there was things that emerged out of this that I didn't foresee. And already the schema that we're working on, it's born out of our dialogos together and was not originally in the argument. And so that dynamic of self, the way the model is being reformulated because of the dialogos around the argument. I think, again, I'm just pointing to the manner of this is also very exciting to me. Like running a progressive argument, I sort of think of it like a line with the dialogos, circling around it, is doing something that the monologic, argument doesn't do. And I just continue to be more and more impressed by that.
I'm totally supportive of that. 100%.
Yeah.
So thank you, both of you gentlemen, as always. And thank you one and all for your time and attention. Look forward to meeting with you next time on the Elusive Eye.
Amen.